Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to talk about something, well, something that's at the very foundation of who you think you are, your memory.
Right. Because we all have it. This incredibly detailed movie of our past, every win, every loss. And we use that movie to tell ourselves who we are today.
And that's where the problem starts, isn't it?
Yeah.
We treat our memory like it's a perfect recording, like a video camera that captured 1995 just as clearly as it did last year.
But it's not. The sources we've been looking at, which connect, early psychoanalysis all the way to modern neuroscience, they all point to something much more, well, unsettling.
Which is that your brain isn't a camera operator.
Not at all. It's a filmmaker. It's a director who is constantly in the editing room, tweaking the script every single time you decide to watch the movie again.
And that really gets to the core question you brought to us, the thing driving this whole deep dive. If you look at Freud, and then you look at what we know about the brain now, it seems like our mind is more interested in telling a good story than it is in recording the facts. So the question becomes, how much of our own story, the one we build our whole identity on, is actually untrue?
It's a huge question. And to make it really concrete, think about this specific anecdote from the research. We all have one. A really vivid, really painful memory of some childhood injustice.
Oh, yeah. The time you were punished and it was totally unfair.
Totally unfair. You remember the words they said, you remember the room, the feeling of betrayal. You can play it back perfectly.
All those core tapes we just run on a loop in our heads.
Exactly. But then, years later, maybe you're talking to your parents or a sibling, and you find out that, well, the core emotion, that feeling of being wronged, that was 100% real.
But the details.
The details are all wrong. Maybe it happened in a different room. Maybe the words you remember so clearly were never actually said. Maybe the whole thing was way less dramatic than the version you've been carrying around for decades.
So the feeling is real, but the facts are fabricated.
Yeah.
And that's just astonishing because that fabricated story is what we've built our present on.
It is. So that's our mission today. We're going to trace this idea. We'll start with Freud, but not the Freud you think. We're starting with his work in neuroanatomy.
And then move through the evidence, the experiments that prove memory is unstable.
And we'll end up with this profound realization. You don't live by the past. You live by the version of the past your present mind allows.
Okay, so let's start with Freud. Because before the couch, before dreams, he was a very different kind of scientist.
He really was a hard scientist. He spent years in a lab dissecting things, mapping the nervous system. He was completely rooted in biology.
I mean, we're talking about a guy meticulously studying the spinal cord of a lamprey fish. Lamprey fish. That's about as far from psychoanalysis as you can get.
It is.
So how on earth does someone that deep in the weeds of physical nerve cells become the father of psychoanalysis? How does he make that jump to memory and desire?
It wasn't really a jump. It was more like a pivot. And it was based on what he and his colleagues, people like John Hewlings Jackson, were observing when the brain breaks.
When it fails.
Right. They were looking at the effects of strokes, brain injuries, disease. And what they saw made it impossible to believe the mind was just a passive recording device.
And this is where the case files come in. These shocking observations that showed the brain was doing something other than just storing data accurately.
Precisely. Let's start with one of the first big shocks. They were observing certain stroke patients, aphakics, who had lost almost their entire ability to use language. They couldn't form sentences, couldn't find words.
But they could say something.
They could say one thing over and over, a single, often meaningless phrase like just go, 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 or some other little fragment.
Yeah.
A linguistic echo.
Which sounds just tragic. Like that's all that's left.
But the insight was what mattered. They didn't see it as just random noise. They saw it as what they called a pivotal point. It was the last, most basic level of communication left when the entire higher system had collapsed.
So when the complex stuff fails, the brain defaults to the most primitive, simple pattern it has left.
Exactly. The system was releasing this lower, deeply ingrained pattern. It was the first clue that the mind is tiered, it's dynamic, and it will always seek some kind of coherence, even if it's a very simple one.
And that idea that the brain defaults to a simple, coherent pattern, that leads right into something far more common, something Freud saw in everyday life.
Right, the confusion between intention and action. This is something we've all experienced.
For sure. You are absolutely certain, 100% convinced that you mailed that important letter.
You can picture it. You remember walking to the mailbox, dropping it in. The memory is crystal clear. but the letter is still sitting on your desk.
So you didn't just forget to do it. You literally created a memory of doing it.
That's the key. That is the critical difference. Your brain had such a strong, powerful intention to do the task that it couldn't tolerate the gap. It couldn't handle the data that said it wasn't done.
So it just patched the footage, it edited the script.
Yeah. It took the memory of getting the letter ready, and it just spliced in the successful ending. Because the drive for a complete, coherent narrative was stronger than the drive for factual accuracy.
Which is almost adaptive, isn't it? If we were constantly aware of every single strong intention we failed to follow through on, we'd be paralyzed.
That's the synthesis, yes. A cohesive story lets us move forward. And this wasn't just a clinical theory. It was proven experimentally by a researcher named Frederick Bartlett.
Ah, the Bartlett experiments.
Mhm.
This is where memory editing really gets put under the microscope.
It really is. What he did was he'd give people a story to read, usually a very strange, culturally foreign story, like a Native American folktale.
Something they wouldn't have a template for.
Exactly. Then he'd ask them to recall it, to tell it back to him multiple times over weeks or even months. And with every single retelling, the story changed.
But not randomly.
Not at all. The editing was systematic. Any detail in the original story that sort of fit with the person's own cultural beliefs, that stayed. It was even emphasized. But any detail that was weird or dissonant,
They got dropped.
it got dropped. Or, and this is the amazing part, it got replaced with something familiar.
Could you give an example of that?
Sure. In one of the original tales, I think, there's a reference to a specific kind of boat, maybe a kayak or something unique to that culture. The English subjects were calling it. They didn't have a file for that. So unconsciously, the kayak would become a canoe or just a small rowboat.
The brain is literally scrubbing the data to make it fit the software it's already running.
Perfectly put. And every single person was completely convinced that their edited, streamlined, familiar version was the original story. They never felt like they were making things up.
The editing is seamless. It happens behind the curtain.
And that brings us to maybe the single most important concept Freud introduced about memory. It's a German word. Nachtraglichkeit.
Okay, that sounds complicated.
The word is, but the idea is actually quite simple. It translates roughly to deferred action, or maybe better, reinterpretation afterwards.
So it's about how we look back.
It's the engine that rewrites our past. Freud realized that an event could happen to you when you're, say, 7 years old. And at the time, it's just data. It doesn't have a huge emotional charge.
Okay.
But then you're 35 and you experience some kind of pain or failure in your life, and your mind looks backward and it finds that memory from when you were 7.
And rereads it.
It rereads that moment through the lens of your 35-year-old pain. And suddenly that minor childhood event is transformed. It's reinterpreted, and it becomes this huge foundational trauma that explains everything.
So the memory wasn't just sitting there perfectly preserved. It was actively rewritten by who I am today.
The past is being continuously rewritten by the present self. That is the core takeaway.
So if the past is that fluid, let's get into the mechanics. Why is the brain built this way? Why is it a scriptwriter and not an archivist? You've synthesized this into four core principles.
Yes. And the first one goes back to Schillings-Jackson and this idea of hierarchical brain evolution.
The tiered building.
Right. Think of the nervous system in 3 levels. The lowest, most primitive level is for reflexes, instincts. The middle level is for emotions, habits, routines. And the highest, most recently evolved level is for conscious thought, language, abstract reasoning.
And under pressure, it's the high level that goes first.
It's the first to get shaky, which then releases the lower levels to come out and play. You don't even need a stroke to see this. Think about when you're incredibly tired or stressed.
Right.
A person who is normally polite and articulate, their high level is in control, gets exhausted or angry, and suddenly they're using crude language or making impulsive decisions. The high level has temporarily weakened, and the lower, more primitive patterns are running the show. Those older systems are always there, waiting.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so principle 2 is about how the brain stores information.
And this was Freud's big break from his colleagues. They were obsessed with finding fixed centers for everything, like a little box in the brain for vocabulary, another box for math.
A memory storage room.
Yeah, and Freud said, no, that's too static. It doesn't explain what we see when the system breaks. He argued the brain is a dynamic network. Functions are distributed across many regions that are all talking to each other, supporting and inhibiting each other.
Which is much closer to how modern neuroscience sees it.
It is. A researcher like A.R. Luria basically proved it decades later. Language isn't in one spot. It requires a whole symphony of brain areas working together. If one part fails, the system tries to compensate. It rewrites the score.
Okay, so that leads to principle 3, which connects all this back to emotion. Memory needs motivation.
This is so critical. You need data for a memory to form a basic biological trace, synapses firing and wiring together. But for that memory to have force, to become one of those big identity-defining stories, it has to be hooked into powerful emotional motivation.
A boring neutral event just doesn't stick around.
It just doesn't have the juice. Freud saw memory as the backward-looking part and motivation as the forward-looking part of the exact same energy flow. We remember intense fear or deep love or profound betrayal because those things activated our entire system. The brain remembers what it needs to remember to survive and get what it wants.
And that brings us to the final principle, the grand conclusion that ties it all together.
Which is simply this. Remembering is reconstruction, not playback. Every time you recall something, you are not opening a file. You are telling a story to your current self through the filter of your current feelings and beliefs.
The brain has to be an editor then. A real, raw, objective past would probably be too chaotic and painful for us to function with.
That's right. It has evolved to maintain our psychological integrity, and that often means smoothing over the historical record.
And this doesn't just apply to individuals. It applies on a massive scale to collective memory, to history itself.
Oh, absolutely. The story a nation tells itself about its founding, its wars, its heroes, that story is constantly being re-edited based on the values of the present moment.
It's large-scale Nachträglichkeit.
That's exactly what it is. When our cultural values change, the way we recount history changes with them. And it's not usually a conscious conspiracy. It's just the new collective mind needing a new coherent story about itself.
So this is the point in the conversation where the ground might feel like it's shaking a bit for anyone listening. If my memory is this unreliable, if my story is always changing, then who am I? How do I anchor myself?
And that feeling, that sense of being a bit unmoored, is actually the start of everything. It's the first step toward real freedom. You have to move past that initial panic and into what we can think of as 4 stages of dealing with a fluid past.
Let's walk through those. Stage 1 is awareness.
Just that. The simple, powerful realization. My memory is not the absolute truth. It's my brain's best story about what happened. The goal here is just to stop treating your personal story as sacred text.
To see it as a version.
Aversion. The moment you do that, you release some of the suffering attached to it. The story that says you're a permanent victim, for instance, suddenly has a question mark next to it. It introduces possibility.
Okay, so after awareness, you're no longer trapped by the single story. What's stage 2?
Stage 2 is insight. This is where you have to get curious and ask, why this story? What internal need is this memory serving for me right now?
So what job is the story doing?
What job is it doing? Is it helping me get sympathy? Is it justifying why I avoid certain things? Is it helping me maintain my comfortable role as the martyr or the tough one or the damaged one? You start to see that the memory is being actively used by your subconscious to prop up your current self-image.
That's a tough thing to look at. See the benefit you're getting from your own suffering narrative.
It can be. But it leads you to stage 3, which is wisdom. This is the active part. You don't deny the event happened. That's not the point. But you make a conscious choice to reread it, to reinterpret it through the lens of your adult maturity.
Can you give us a concrete example of that?
Sure. Let's say the old story was, I was abandoned as a child, and that's why I can't trust anyone. The new story, the one written with wisdom, might become, that early experience taught me about the fragility of human connection, and it inspired me to become someone who consciously builds authentic, trustworthy relationships.
So the facts of the event are the same, but the meaning, the conclusion you draw from it, is completely different.
You shift its emotional utility from a limitation to a strength. You are consciously using Nachträglichkeit for your own growth.
And that leads to the final stage, illumination.
Yes. This is when you start living that new narrative. Your life itself becomes the evidence. You stop being defined by the old story and you start being defined by the wisdom you've gained. And in doing that, your own life becomes a kind of light for other people, showing them that they aren't trapped by their old stories either.
So we started this journey with Freud looking at fish spines, and we've ended here with the freedom to rewrite our own minds. The lesson from all this data seems to be that you can't erase what happened to you.
You can't?
But you always have the power to reread it, to re-understand it, and to place yourself in a bigger story where you are growing, not stuck.
That's it. The ultimate liberation isn't finding the true past. That search is a distraction, because a perfectly fixed past probably doesn't even exist in a way we can access. The real freedom is exercising your right, today, to change how that past is told. We are storytelling creatures, and the way we tell our story right now, that's what determines how we're going to live tomorrow.